Hello, EE Scholars! Welcome to lesson number 1 in my Ecology and Evolution series. Today we'll be going over the different types of causation, anthropomorphism, and the whole stimuli, innate releasing mechanism, fixed action pattern process. But before that, what exactly is ecology? Well, ecology is the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. So everything within this course will relate to different types of animal relationships or how animals interact with their environments and other things like that. Alright, now that we've got a basic understanding of what the class is about, let's turn our attention to one of the main focuses for today. So everything has a cause. The things that we see in nature, relationships, coloration, morphological characteristics are no exception. Scientists typically group the causation for these things into two groups, proximate and ultimate. Proximate causation refers to how something happens. It's the mechanism behind a behavior or a characteristic. Let's take a look at the example. A rise in central dopamine causes an increase in aggression. Now, we don't really have to know what dopamine is or why it increases aggression to know what type of causation this is. All we need to know is whether it's more mechanistic or evolutionarily adaptive. So, if we were to analyze this and reword it a bit, we could say that central dopamine causes aggression. Then, breaking that down a little further, we could say that dopamine is the mechanism of increased aggression. Remember, proximate causation is very mechanistic. So, in this case, this would be an example of proximate causation. Another way you could think about this is in terms of how versus why. We've already established that proximate causation is the how part of causation. So if the example answers how something occurs, then it's proximate. How is aggression increased? Well, we've been told that it's increased by a rise in central dopamine. This example provides a solution for how the outcome occurs. So, by this method, we still come back to the conclusion that this is an example of proximate causation. Next, we have ultimate causation. As I mentioned before, proximate causation is more mechanistic, making it more immediate and occurring within an individual's lifetime, while ultimate causation is in it for the long game. Ultimate causation takes many generations to come to fruition, and it's the why of causation. For example, let's say that birds eat seeds to gain energy, which they do. Now, what would make this behavior evolutionarily adaptive? In other words, why do birds eat seeds? Well, the example tells us that birds eat seeds in order to gain energy, which is pretty important. Since we know why birds eat seeds, then we can conclude that this is an example of ultimate causation. Now, you might be thinking that an example could come up where you have both ultimate and proximate causation. For example, birds eat seeds with their uniquely shaped beaks in order to gain energy. But you won't really have to worry about that in this class. Most, if not all, of the examples you're given will be either one or the other. For example, if we take another look at the dopamine statement over here, we already know that it answers the how question. But if we ask why dopamine increases aggression, we don't really have an answer. From this statement alone, we don't know why aggression is evolutionarily adaptive or why the body may want to increase the behavior through dopamine. In this case, we can answer the how, but not the why, making this example proximate. Let's take a look at the other example. Again, we've already established that birds eat seeds to gain energy answers the why. But what about the how? From this statement, do we know how birds eat seeds or how they convert the seeds to energy? No. So this example, which answers the why but not the how, is an example of ultimate causation alone. Squirrels bury their nuts so that they can have food after the winter. Is this proximate or ultimate? I'll give you a few seconds to think it through. Ready? It's ultimate. Why does a squirrel bury its nuts? So that it can have food in the winter. How does a squirrel bury its nuts? Probably with its paws, but the statement doesn't really tell us, so we can't answer that question. Let's try another example. Monkeys eat by using their hands. Ultimate or proximate? Proximate. How do they eat? With their hands. Why do they eat? Again, we can probably guess the answer, but the information that we're given doesn't directly state it. Prolonged exposure of a G protein to a specific stimulus can cause it to bind to arrestin, which ultimately ends its interaction with the stimulus. Is this an example of ultimate causation or proximate causation? Okay, this one's a little tricky, so I'll give you some more time to think it through. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video, but we're going to go on to the answer. This is actually an example of proximate causation. How does the G protein receptor stop interacting with a stimulus? It binds to arrestin. Why does it stop interacting with the stimulus? We don't really know. Now, this one was a little trickier than the other two for a couple of reasons. One, there was probably some unfamiliar terminology in there. Two, there's actually the potential for ultimate causation in this example. Instead of looking for the how and why of the G protein receptor interacting with a stimulus, let's see what happens if we look at the G protein receptor binding to arrestin. Why does the G protein receptor bind to arrestin? To stop interacting with the stimulus. How does it bind to arrestin? We don't know. So, if we were looking at it that way, then it would be ultimate causation. So, why can't we look at it that way? Well, let's take another look at the example. It says that a G protein receptor, which we don't need to worry about what that actually is, binds to arrestin, and that causes the receptor to stop interacting with a stimulus. The end result of this process is that the G protein receptor stops interacting with a stimulus. That is the thing that this whole process is moving towards. So that's why we focus on the decreased interaction instead of arrestin binding. In general, when we look for the causation of something, we want to look at the end result of a chain of events and not the events themselves. Arrestin is only part of the process that stops a G protein receptor from interacting with the stimulus. It is not the main focus of the example. It's time to move on to anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is defined as assigning human characteristics or traits to non-human beings. In the context of this class, the non-human beings are going to just be animals. Anthropomorphism comes in all forms. It can be as simple as an adjective, or it can be as thought out as an entire character. Here I listed a few common examples. Starting from the top, Sneaky Fox is anthropomorphic because sneaky is strictly a human trait. Sneaky would imply that the fox is purposely deceitful or underhanded. However, we cannot really say what the fox's intentions are at any given moment. We can only observe what it does. So, calling the fox sneaky is anthropomorphic. Happy as a clam falls into the same category. We don't know if a clam is truly happy, and happiness is generally defined as a human trait. So, happy as a clam is also anthropomorphic. Finally, you'll see over in the corner here another good example of anthropomorphism. Notice how Mickey is standing upright, steering a boat, and wearing clothes. All of these things are very human-like, and none of them really apply to a mouse. So, it's all anthropomorphic. Alright, let's do some practice. In this semi-paragraph, there are multiple examples of anthropomorphism. Disclaimer, this information may not be true at all. I just made it up for an example, so don't quote me on any of this. But see if you can spot all the anthropomorphism in these 4 sentences. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video. Alright, so there are about 6 examples of anthropomorphism in these sentences. They're all highlighted in yellow. I'll explain the green ones in a little bit. For now, let's begin with love. We cannot say that birds love anything. That's very anthropomorphic. There's no way for us to conclusively tell how birds feel about anything. We can observe what they do, but we can't really make any conclusions based on that over how they feel. So, anthropomorphism. Moving on to singing, this is more so anthropomorphism by technicality than anything else. All of the definitions that I saw for singing stated that there was an inherently musical element. Generally, birds vocalize to communicate, not for musical purposes, so this would be anthropomorphism. Next, we have cure boredom. This one should have been a little obvious. Again, we can't state how the birds are feeling, and we definitely can't say that they're doing something based on feeling. After cure boredom is proudly. Just like love and cure boredom, we can't tell how a bird is feeling. The next one is song. Like sing, it's based on a technicality. A song is defined as a metric composition. For people who don't know anything about music, that pretty much just means that they have very particular spacing between each note. Without this, there'd be basically no rhythm to a song. Whenever birds vocalize, their vocalizations aren't quite as organized as a song, so calling their vocalizations a song would be anthropomorphism. Finally, we have voice. A voice is something that only people have, so it's anthropomorphic to say that a bird has a voice. We'd probably call it something more like a vocalization. While you went through this exercise, there may have been a couple of words that you thought were anthropomorphism but actually weren't. I highlighted those in green. Let's go through why they're not really quick. So, for display, the word itself just means to put something in view. If we were to extrapolate view onto the 4 other senses, then we can easily determine that the bird displayed its song by vocalizing in the open. Lastly, choose is not anthropomorphism because a bird can select a particular option. For example, with the mates, if a female mates with one male and neglects all the others, then we can comfortably say that she has chosen that male. The last thing we'll be covering in this lesson is the stimuli, innate releasing mechanism, fixed action pattern process. First, we'll need to define what a stimulus is. A stimulus is something that causes something else to happen, develop, or become more active. For example, good music may be the stimulus for someone to sing along, or someone coming towards you on the street may be the stimulus for you to move out of the way. When we're talking about a stimulus in the context of an innate releasing mechanism and fixed action pattern, we can call it by 3 names: sign stimulus, key stimulus, and releaser. For the rest of this lesson, I'm going to refer to it as sign stimulus, but all of these mean the same thing. The innate releasing mechanism is defined as a neural sensory motor interface that mediates between a key stimulus and a fixed action pattern. In other words, it's the recognition of a stimulus, which then results in a fixed action pattern. So, let's think back to the example of moving out of the way for someone. First, we have the stimulus. A person is approaching you. Let's call this step A. That results in you moving out of the way. I'll call this step B. In order to get from step A to step B, there's something that needs to happen. You need to recognize that someone's coming towards you. So, the full process is that you see someone approaching, recognize that they're approaching and that you need to move out of the way, and then you finally move out of the way. This middle step where you neurologically recognize that someone is approaching and that you must move is the innate releasing mechanism. Last but not least, we have the fixed action pattern. This is defined as a stereotypical behavior that results from a specific stimulus. Notice how I said stereotypical. This means that it's the same for every member in a group. In this case, a species. A behavior is not a fixed action pattern if it is unique to each individual. For example, choosing a pumpkin pie or a donut is not a fixed action pattern. However, reaching for one of these options as a result of hunger would be, because it is innately shared across everyone in our species. Let's take a look at this example. A dog enters a room that contains food. The dog smells the food, which activates certain neurons, and then salivates. Here, we have a sign stimulus, an innate releasing mechanism, and a fixed action pattern. The sign stimulus is the food. The food prompts the dog to produce a specific behavior. The innate releasing mechanism is when the dog smells the food and certain neurons are activated. The fixed action pattern, or the resulting behavior, is when the dog salivates. Let's try this. A cat sees a bird and then chirps. And yes, it's actually called chirping, I made sure to check. They typically chirp when they're excited. Anyway, go ahead and try this one on your own. See if you can identify the sign stimulus, innate releasing mechanism, and fixed action pattern. If you need more time, feel free to pause the video. So, we needed to find three things. First, the sign stimulus, the thing that caused the behavior, is the bird. The cat, the organism doing the action, saw the bird and chirped in response. That takes us to the next thing we needed to find. The innate releasing mechanism is the cat's recognition of the bird. The cat saw the bird and cognitively recognized that it was a bird, which resulted in its final behavior. Speaking of which, that resulting behavior, the fixed action pattern, was chirping. Let's try another example. A bird notices the change in temperature, which indicates an oncoming winter, and migrates south. Take a minute and try to determine the sign stimulus, innate releasing mechanism, and fixed action pattern. The sign stimulus is the oncoming winter. Now, if you wanted to say it was the change in temperature, I'd take that too. But the temperature was only caused by the oncoming winter, which is what the birds are ultimately trying to avoid. The innate releasing mechanism was the part where the birds sensed and recognized the lowering temperatures. Finally, the fixed action pattern was when it migrated south. We went over quite a few things today. For a little review, there are two types of causation, proximate and ultimate. Proximate causation answers how. It's mechanistic and occurs in an individual's lifetime. On the other hand, ultimate causation answers why. It's evolutionary and occurs over many generations. Anthropomorphism is when human characteristics are assigned to non-human being. This can be things like traits, behaviors, emotions, and so on. A stimulus that prompts a fixed action pattern can be referred to by three names: sign stimulus, key stimulus, and releaser. The innate releasing mechanism, abbreviated IRM, is the recognition step in between a sign stimulus and a fixed action pattern. A fixed action pattern, which can be abbreviated FAP, is the stereotypical behavior that occurs because of a sign stimulus. If you need extra practice on any of these steps, I'll attach a link to a practice quiz and its answers in the description. And that concludes our first lesson for ecology and evolution. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.